Great. I hope you guys enjoyed lunch. So for this session, I really wanted to talk, both of you have such illustrious backgrounds, working with lots of different types of companies, big and small, and you've seen things from when there are 4 people in the room to when they've scaled to a very massive size. And so the culture that's sort of embodied within those, on either end of that scale, is very, very different. And so I'd love to get a sense from both of you about, either when you're looking at companies you'd like to work with or that you want to invest in, what are you thinking about in terms of the type of culture that says, oh, this is a good investment, this is something that's going to work? Like, what are the things you look for?
So from an investment perspective, when you're doing kind of seed Series A investment, culture is not something that is actually, in fact, highly identified within the company because the culture is the people, right? It's the initial founding team. That is actually frequently what drives it. And so what you're looking for is what are the kinds of founders that would actually, in fact, run the race well, which includes recruiting a bunch of people and establishing a company that will actually, in fact, scale to a really strong basis. And the kinds of things you're looking for are a sense of being, actually, in fact, part of success from a startup perspective is, are you edgy enough and different enough in the ways that will match to success? So for example, is your problem an engineering problem, in which case you're really edgy engineers and it's kind of an engineering-centric culture? Is it a product problem? Is it a sales problem? Is it a marketing problem? You're looking for, because part of actually, for example, defining a good culture is not, like a litmus test is not all A players would want to work at your culture. Like for example, a classically defined bad cultures, we're just excellent, right? Like, okay, right? Doesn't actually give you anything to cohere. And part of what happens, like, so I'm doing this work on blitzscaling, which is one of the secrets of Silicon Valley is fast acceleration into global opportunities from a startup. And all of those companies that do it have strong cultures. And the reason is because that strong culture creates horizontal accountability. So if you were relying upon essentially top-down programming a culture and not actually, in fact, here's who we are, here's who should join, and here's who should not be part of this, and that kind of play style is not central, then you actually, in fact, can't scale at the speed that we usually try to do from a startup. So those are the kinds of things I look for on an investment.
And now that I've been at MIT for the last 5 years, so my perspective is looking at kids who leave MIT and do startups, and then a lot of big companies who then come and try to work with us. So those are the 2 different cultures, sort of. And one thing that I've noticed is that, sort of to Reid's point, the culture of the founding team has a lot to do with obviously where they came from. So, a lot of the kids at the Media Lab are product designers. They understand kind of the fit between technology and the market. Whereas across the street we have the computer science and artificial intelligence lab, and they're coders. So for instance, Drew Houston, who did Dropbox, so he's more from the computer science side. And at the Media Lab we always talk about creativity and freedom and making and I asked Drew, and I guess this is public because it was at a meeting, and I said, well, what was it that you got out of MIT? And I said, I learned how to work my ass off, and I was able to become such a strong engineer that I could recruit other strong engineers. And so his culture and his product, to Reid's point, is about really, really difficult engineering problems. So his sort of success comes from recruiting the best engineers possible, which is very different from some of my other kids who are about recruiting a bunch of designers and competing with companies that have people walking around in red shoelaces. So it's interesting also to think about, and the hardest part I think is when you build the company, you are more likely to find and know people that are similar to you. And so as an engineering company, you're going to have to find salespeople, you're going to have to find designers, and vice versa. So even in a university, it's how do we connect to like Harvard Business School or Sloan and get the business person, or how do we attract the engineer, and that cross-fertilization and bringing some, and I think to Reid's point, I think every company has a sort of a founding premise, and it's a lot is where the founder comes from. The tricky part is how do you make the other components of the business feel appreciated in a culture that's driven by sales or a culture that's driven by engineering, and that's actually pretty tricky. I think even the successful big companies sort of kludge together. Like Google's a typical example of a sort of engineering culture, and they do design, but it's still from a very sort of engineer's approach.
Yeah, that reminds me of something you mentioned backstage. We're talking about this idea of when culture starts, and you were kind of like, well, if there's 4 people in the room, you're like looking at each other, and it's just the 4 of you guys. It's not really, there's not necessarily, unless you're Drew and you're someone who's an intense engineer, there isn't necessarily a specific thing that embodies the culture from the jump. And so does it matter when it starts? Do you have to have that founding principle, or is it something that can coalesce as the company grows and sort of figures out kind of what is the most, will make it more successful?
So I think all of the successful scale companies actually, in fact, do end up with some sort of strong culture. Because you just actually, in fact, it's a necessary component for doing it. Typically, the way it plays out is because of the imprint from the founders who go, we are this, like, and this is the kind of thing, and then that gets driven through the organization. That is typically where most of the Silicon Valley cultures get to a scale. And it's part of what you're looking at is that we are this, we are solving this problem, we're good at this, whether it's engineering, product, sales, et cetera. And they have to get to inclusion and a unified culture in a good way. A few, and this is actually one of the things that I learned last year when I started doing the blitzscaling work and talking to smart folks like Reid Hastings and other kinds of folks about, actually, in fact, I think one of the tools that all of these companies should put in their tool chest is to actually do cultural definition. It's actually one of the things that I learned from Jeff Weiner when he came on board as kind of a refounding moment for how to do scale at LinkedIn. And part of the thing is actually being very thoughtful and open and discussing culture where you're setting something. And Jeff does some things. Reid Hastings is the classic Netflix culture deck. And actually, I now think that all of these companies, as you begin to get to the scale, call it 100, 150 people where you begin to go to, we don't actually all know each other. You should have an explicit, here is who we are, this is what our culture is, both for us internally about how we keep ourselves horizontally accountable. And you can do it early if you want to. And also, like part of how Hastings got to the Netflix deck is what they were learning is that the people that would, the common cause for ejection was that they'd hire a really competent person, they'd come, and then they'd leave because they weren't a culture fit. And so, and that's actually fine because you want to define culture, but it was like, well, we should publish our culture so that people know it. So when they're coming in, it's what they want and what they're looking for, right? Because some people would come in saying, well, I'm expecting a family, and we're a family, and we're going to be here forever. And he comes in and say, actually, we're a sports team, and actually, in fact, anyone who doesn't fit, we should give them a good severance and say goodbye, including 1 month in, right? As a way of doing it. And some people felt that being alien. And actually, in fact, that kind of culture definition is, I actually think, one of the things that's a key thing for going to scale. And there's a lot of different high-performing cultures. I mean, if you look at, Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, there's a bunch of these different things where you go, okay, Oracle, there's a bunch of different high-performing cultures. And so which one are we? And this is how we're playing the game.
Although I think over time, as a company gets bigger, because we're talking, a lot of Silicon Valley is still first generation, and if you look at, but even some of the first, like Amazon didn't put the Kindle team in headquarters, and it had a distinctively different culture, and I know that because it was a little bit related to the media lab, but like at the PlayStation team from Sony was a very different culture from Sony, and I think there's a lot of success, or the Watson team at IBM right now. I think that when you, especially if it's a sales culture, but not necessarily, where you have a very strong culture, but you need to do something new, like create a new product. We're working with Target, and they've got a very creative team now working with us. And I think that's sometimes important, and it's tricky, because I think I think there are probably more failures than successes at trying to do sort of this sort of cultural offshoot thing, but I think it's an important way for large companies to deal with innovation.
I actually 100% agree. What I think you do is you have to, a culture fork, usually done by physical separation, sometimes other things, can be different hiring practices, it can be a whole bunch of different things. Has to be approved by the CEO and the execs who kind of are bought into it. And then it's a very high cost, because every time you have connection points, you have the two entities being confused. So the prize has to be so worth it, so essential, that you'll go, okay, we'll pay this cost. Right.
Absolutely, and I think the Kindle example is really interesting, and the Netflix culture deck is really interesting as two types of techniques that have worked to sort of foster some particular type of aesthetic within those companies. I mean, are there any other examples that jump out of techniques employed by Silicon Valley leaders that have worked to drive performance, or have totally, I mean, if they're publicly known, I don't know, but that have totally not worked, and wild cultural experiments that didn't actually pan out?
Well, there's cultural failures. Usually a lot of the failure is not thinking enough about what the culture stuff is and not being definitive about what you're doing. I mean, interesting success cases include like Android at Google, which actually had somewhat separate badging, separate hiring, kind of a hiring regimen and so forth, because they were trying to tackle that particular problem. Now they were housed at Google, but they had some kind of unique space. Usually a cultural fork also requires a kind of a founder leader, right? Somebody who is willing to cut against the grain some in order to kind of go to the result. Those are the things I've seen. I have to think a little bit about failure cases.
Yeah, well, one failure case, which is kind of a category, are non-Silicon Valleys creating corporate venture capital arms in Silicon Valley. Because they underestimate a lot of things. And then the other problem is it's hard. Investing is hard, and I think it's. And then as a co-investor, there are a very small number of exceptions, but as a rule, I don't like to work with them because they get confused with the strategic reason for investing versus the commercial reason. And so if you want a strategic round, you probably want to be talking to the company itself. And if you want a VC, you want somebody who's not encumbered by a bunch of values or culture from the company. And so you get this kind of weird identity problem.
I'd say one thing, there is this kind of, Joe reminds me of this kind of common thought amongst existing companies to say the way that we will participate in Silicon Valley is we'll open an innovation lab in Silicon Valley. And I'm not going to name names, but I've never seen them work. And the key thing I think that doesn't work is what really makes a lot of the Silicon Valley stuff go is the network and the participation in the network. And the network has a lot of different components. It has venture capitalists, it has executives, there's professors, there's students, that kind of thing. And so the key thing, if I were trying that play, would not be I'm there now and I hired a few people and we have our little lab that's kind of cooking. It's how do I connect to the network really effectively within Silicon Valley? I'm not sure that's sufficient, but I'm certain it's necessary.
And there's actually this is not specific to Silicon Valley. I mean, a lot of people talk about the Google 20% time, and I think there are some good innovations from that, but that's actually an old thing. I think you can go all the way back to 3M's invention of Scotch tape, or actually it was masking tape, and it was an engineer who, it was just before the Depression, right? I think it was in the, and it's like, I can't remember the year, but he noticed that people were using very strong tape when they were doing two-tone cars, and they were making sanding paper at the time, and he said, okay, well, we understand paper and adhesives, I'm going to invent better masking tape. And the CEO said, no, okay, stop doing that, we're a sandpaper company. But he kept doing it, and eventually the legend goes, he walked in, saw the guy still doing it, and sort of walked away and let him do that. And then he eventually created masking tape that eventually becomes Scotch tape, and it saves the company because during the Depression, people don't buy new stuff. They were using Scotch tape to fix stuff. And I think that sort of embedded into 3M this idea that there's going to be a lot of innovation on the edges. And when I see companies interacting with us, part of it also is a culture of whether you allow the periphery of your company to be doing innovative things, or whether you're sort of centrally commanding and controlling. So even some of the larger companies, some of them have more, and it requires a CEO, right? So because you can create, so we get a lot of chief innovation officers who aren't empowered, and it's kind of like the newer version of what people used to get forced on them as a CMO, right? But it's basically a person who's stuck with innovation but isn't empowered to do it, and so it's a really bad position. But if the CEO's on board, you can sort of push innovation across the company, and then we've seen a lot of successes where companies can sort of launch off these culture forks.
And we'll open it up to questions in just a moment. But I wanted to ask broadly if there are any kind of cultural trends that you're seeing among companies. I mean, you know, you were talking about the value of the network, talking about innovation around the edges. The network in Silicon Valley's net worth is a lot higher than it used to be, and sort of there's this sort of, you know, I wonder if people still feel it's fun to make things for the sake of making them, just to see what could come out of it. And so, especially at the MIT Media Lab, I mean, do you encounter young chief executives and founders who still want to make the world a better place, or is there sort of more of a culture of trying to maximize financial returns, or are they not mutually exclusive? I mean, I'm curious.
We actually were talking about that. It's more, to me, I frame it more as an East Coast, West Coast thing. But I'll let Reid start.
No, with that, you got to start.
So I won't name names, but in terms of like specific universities, but I do find that the let's just call it the shape of investment and innovation for a software company, where you can scale in a particular way, has a different speed and a velocity and a different culture, let's say, than say biotech or manufacturing or B2B, where it involves government regulations. And what I do find is that Silicon Valley has created an engine for a very high speed kind of venture business, and so they picked all the low-hanging fruit. Like, most of it's gone, right? And it's all here. And I think but there's still more coming out, obviously. But so I don't think anyone's really going to be able to compete with that. And so the kids that are in that sort of style all end up here. I think and obviously there's stuff everywhere else, but it's just in terms of just the scale. I do think that there's a different category of entrepreneurship that may take longer, may take more relationships with governments, maybe have a variety of reasons why, let's say, a first-year VC in Silicon Valley wouldn't want to look at it, because it doesn't have the scale and the speed that they would. And I see a lot of those kids sort of hanging out more sort of on the East Coast. So what I do find is that it's easier. So the kids, I find it at the Media Lab and other places, are trying to work on longer, bigger problems. I'm just averaging this all out. Obviously, there are kids who are short-term, but I do find kids sort of hanging around saying, okay, what's the big, long play, right? And again, I don't want to make it a values judgment, but because, I think there are people out here trying to save the world too, but that velocity is very different, and so the problems that you find them trying to tackle are different. And so one of the things I'm trying to do with Reid is to see how can we connect Silicon Valley and New York and Boston in an appropriate way to take advantage of the difference in culture, rather than sort of weirdly compete, which is...
Or as opposed to oil and water, what are the good chemical combinations that actually create better outcomes? Because the incentive here, like the icons tend to be very fast moving, right? That's part of the reason, doing this work on blitzscaling, which is the real key thing tends to be a fast clock, making progress, having some sense of measurement about that. That tends to go a little bit against okay, it'll take us 2 years to figure out, even if we have something. Tends to go a little bit against, kind of raw, kind of science risk, or really wild tech risk. And so naturally, when you say you're doing those kinds of things, being here is difficult because you're in the shadow of these other things that are growing very quickly. And so, like, for example, investors tend to go, well, actually, in fact, something that's growing quickly next year is actually much more valuable than something that might grow quickly 3 years from now. And so, you can think of it as almost like a forest ecology, is where can you actually get the best sunlight? And that's part of the area where there's times where you can work together, and there's times where actually, plant the tree here or plant the tree here. Now, that being said, obviously there's a lot of stuff going on in Silicon Valley around genetics and energy and everything else, because it's still, you see that on both coasts.
Absolutely. Great. Okay, we've got a few minutes left. I'd love to open it up to questions. I see you gentlemen down there.
Stowe Boyd from GigHome. I want to ask you a question, Reid. A couple of years ago, you wrote a piece in the Harvard Business Review with a couple of your colleagues where you offered up the notion of terms of service.
Terms of duty.
Terms of duty.
Yep.
Right. And I wonder, could you take a second to explain what it is, but also, are there companies that are actually actively putting that in place that you know of?
There are a number of companies putting it in place. I actually don't know what I'm allowed, because we have this little a consulting group that actually helps with them. I'm not sure in confidence. So Stowe, you have my email address. You can email me, and I can see which of those ones I'm allowed to say. But basically, the idea of a career of duty is the notion of lifetime employment is in most industries going away. But how do you actually have a mutual compact by which employees invest in the long term of the company, and the company invests in the long term of the employee, given a much more flexible employment relationship? And so lifetime employment goes to lifetime employability. And so what we advocate, and this is something we see a lot of in Silicon Valley, is where the conversation between manager and employee is say, look, let's define a tour of duty as kind of as a moral contract. Usually, at least X years, 2, 3, 4, 5, sometimes 10, depends on what the thing is. And here's how we invest in you and increasing your employability, whether it's here or other places. And here's how you invest in the company and make the company go. Like hopefully increase its curve and be very sustaining and strong. And part of the reason that's important is when you actually think about how the kind of modern age is both employers and employees do know that people go and work at different places. And if you're having a conversation by which both are pretending with each other that it's going to be lifetime here for sure, that creates distrust, right? And it creates distrust because you're like, okay, we both know it, but we're not talking about it. And that actually means, oh, we're actually not being fully open and honest with each other. Well, what else are we not being open and honest with each other before? That does not create good culture.
Okay. Anyone else? Oh, sure. Great.
Hi, my name's Heather Hiles, and I'm with a company called PathBright, which I founded and just sold to Cengage Learning. But my question is, increasingly I'm working with large companies and really enjoyed your book, The Alliance, and that sort of thing. And I'm wondering, how can we advance the movement of equitable inclusion and advancement of a diverse workforce? There's such a schism that just seems to be widening. And I'm wondering, what could we do with technology and data specifically to help advance that movement?
So technology and data, a lot of companies are now doing reports. I know we're doing that as well, and Pat's here and will be on the stage later, and she's sitting over there. You can ask her about what we're doing. She's the head of HR talent at LinkedIn. And there's a bunch of different companies doing that. So that's the data HR. I actually think implementing things like the Rooney Rule within tech companies is a good thing that I recommend most people do, if at all possible. And then there's also, part of one of the things I'm working on with a guy named Byron Ageist at the New America, which is this opportunity at work, which is how do we massively use the trend for these tech boot camps to actually get a bunch of inclusion, women, minorities, et cetera, into the tech jobs. So once they start doing, whether it's a DB admin or QA or web developer, you can then begin making the progress through it. So how do you get on base to be making that progress? So actually doing pipeline stuff really matters too.
And I think, talking about pipeline, I think that you have to go all the way down the pipe to the community. And and my sister works on this space a lot, but a lot of this is really a social problem and not a lot of Silicon Valley people say, well, we've opened everything up, all our courses are online, but unless you create a culture, one of interest, and then secondly of because a lot of this technology stuff requires mentorship. Right, and so there's like a boys' club, and you can read the manuals, but you still don't get it unless somebody's looking over your shoulder and helping you. And so I think you have to change the culture, and it's pretty hard. And so, for instance, for us, our diversity is very poor. We admit more than the pipeline. But our pipeline's not good. And so what I'm actively first I started going out to colleges, but now I'm going all the way out to the communities and trying to get people to create these cultures where people will be interested in. And so it's interesting because it's both ends, because the jobs sort of define what education does, but our pipeline defines the diversity that we have. So I think you have to kind of look at the whole system.
And one gender thing that I can say that you can't, that I think is great, is your sister, Mimi Ito, is doing this connected camp stuff using Minecraft. And I'm actually hopeful that will balance out gender more within CS in terms of its long-term output.
Yeah.
So it's called connected camps, right? That's the,
Yeah.
Because of the popularity of Minecraft?
Yeah, Minecraft being both genders.
That's
right.
wild.
Yeah,
That's
so
great.
that was like, oh, cool, do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. I mean, that's the tail end of our time, and we could talk forever on this, but I want to thank you both for joining me on stage and for your thoughtful questions and for this afternoon.